Director Kesrath Val had spent 16 years perfecting the Ostrankai Empire's most sophisticated psychological warfare program, a weapon designed to turn a conquered species' greatest strength into the instrument of its own destruction, and he chose humanity as his final proof of concept because their intelligence file listed loyalty as their single most exploitable trait. He was correct about the loyalty. He was catastrophically wrong about what exploiting it would actually produce. The Ostrankai Empire had built 3 centuries of successful conquest on a single, elegant strategic principle. Every species carried within its own greatest virtue the seed of its eventual undoing. Courage, properly manipulated, became recklessness that shattered coordinated resistance into isolated, easily eliminated pockets. Intelligence, redirected through carefully constructed misinformation, became a liability that produced confident, catastrophically wrong strategic decisions. And loyalty, the Empire's considerable accumulated doctrine had proven across dozens of successful campaigns, was perhaps the most exploitable virtue of all, because a population fiercely devoted to its own people could be turned, with sufficiently patient psychological engineering, into a weapon that tore itself apart from within. Director Kesrath Val had built his entire considerable career on refining this specific doctrine, and Program Fractured Mirror, the culmination of 16 years of methodical psychological research, represented what he genuinely believed to be his life's most significant strategic achievement. Human loyalty, he explained to the Empire's War Council, presenting the program's theoretical framework 3 years before its actual deployment against Earth, operates according to a predictable, exploitable pattern our extensive intelligence gathering has documented across dozens of human conflicts throughout their own recorded history. Humans demonstrate extraordinary devotion to their immediate social groups, family, community, nation. A devotion so powerful it regularly produces behavior our own species would consider genuinely irrational, individuals sacrificing personal safety, resources, and even their lives for people they have never met, simply because those people share a designated in-group identity. Program Fractured Mirror does not attempt to weaken this loyalty. That approach, based on considerable prior Ostrankai conquest experience against other species, generally fails because loyalty this deeply embedded resists direct suppression. Instead, we redirect it. We construct false in-group identities, carefully engineered social divisions calibrated to exploit humanity's existing historical fault lines, and we allow their own extraordinary capacity for loyalty to do our work for us, turning human against human with a ferocity our own direct military intervention could never hope to match. The program's initial deployment, 6 months into what Ostrankai High Command anticipated would be a relatively brief and low-cost psychological campaign preceding formal invasion, proceeded with the methodical precision Director Val's 16 years of preparation had promised. Ostrankai intelligence assets, embedded across human digital communication networks through infiltration methods refined across years of careful preparation, began the patient work of amplifying and exaggerating humanity's existing social and political divisions, constructing increasingly elaborate false narratives, specifically designed to fracture communities along carefully identified fault lines. The early results appeared, by every metric Director Val's considerable analytical framework prioritized, genuinely promising. We are observing exactly the kind of escalating social division our program was designed to produce, reported Vesin Korath, the Operations Field Intelligence Coordinator, 6 weeks into the campaign's active phase. Human social media platforms show measurable increases in intergroup hostility across every demographic category our targeting algorithms prioritized. Political polarization metrics have increased considerably beyond baseline projections. Our program appears to be functioning precisely as designed. What Director Val's considerable psychological warfare expertise had not adequately anticipated, buried beneath 16 years of careful theoretical preparation that had never once been tested against actual, sustained human resistance, was what happened when the carefully engineered social fractures his program had constructed collided directly with the specific, stubborn loyalty patterns his own intelligence file had correctly identified but fundamentally failed to understand. The first sign of genuine trouble emerged 4 months into the campaign, in a small American city where HFY psychological operatives had spent considerable resources cultivating a particularly promising fracture line, a manufactured controversy, specifically engineered to divide the community along lines of economic anxiety and cultural resentment that the Empire's analysts had identified as unusually potent within that specific regional context. The engineered division is producing exactly the escalation our models predicted, Vesenkorath reported, reviewing data from the specific target community with what appeared to be genuine professional satisfaction. Community cohesion metrics show significant degradation. Trust indicators between the two manufactured factions have collapsed considerably below baseline. We are prepared to escalate the operation toward its intended conclusion. The intended conclusion, according to Program Fractured Mirror's carefully constructed theoretical framework, involved allowing the manufactured social division to escalate toward genuine, self-sustaining conflict, a fracture so complete that the target community would effectively neutralize itself, consuming resources and attention that would otherwise have been directed toward organized resistance against the Empire's eventual formal invasion. What actually happened in the weeks that followed bore almost no resemblance to that carefully constructed theoretical prediction. Director, I require your immediate review of updated field intelligence, Vesenkorath reported, 7 months into the campaign, his previously confident tone carrying a genuine uncertainty that Director Val's considerable experience recognized, with mounting professional alarm, as the specific signature of an operation beginning to unravel in ways his doctrine had not anticipated. The manufactured division within the target community appears to be revering. Community cohesion metrics, which showed significant degradation 6 weeks ago, have not merely stabilized but have subsequently increased considerably beyond original baseline measurements. We are observing coordinated community response patterns our operational model did not predict. Director Val reviewed the updated intelligence with the careful, methodical attention his considerable career had trained him to bring to unexpected data, and discovered, with a specific, mounting professional dread, that his 16 years of theoretical preparation had failed to account for something his own species' historical experience with conquered populations had genuinely never previously encountered. Humanity, once the target community had eventually recognized, through investigative journalism and grassroots community, organizing that his own psychological operatives had never anticipated as a meaningful countermeasure, that their carefully manufactured internal conflict had been deliberately engineered by an external hostile actor, had not fractured further under the revelation. They had instead redirected the very loyalty program Fractured Mirror had been specifically designed to weaponize, turning it outward, toward a unified, coordinated response against the actual, external threat that had attempted to manipulate them. This represents a fundamental failure of our operational theory, Director Val admitted, during an emergency review session convened specifically to address the program's increasingly unexpected trajectory. Our doctrine assumed that manufactured internal division, once successfully established, would prove self-sustaining, consuming a target population's loyalty resources through internal conflict rather than external resistance. Humanity's response pattern suggests something our considerable intelligence gathering failed to adequately anticipate, that human loyalty, once a population recognizes external manipulation as the actual source of their internal conflict, does not simply dissolve or redirect toward continued internal fracture. It appears to consolidate, with remarkable speed, into a considerably more dangerous, unified resistance specifically directed against whoever attempted the manipulation in the first place. The pattern, once identified, proved consistent across nearly every community program Fractured Mirror had targeted during its 7 months of active deployment. Manufactured divisions, however carefully engineered and initially successful, consistently reached a critical threshold at which some portion of the affected population began investigating the actual source of their community's sudden, inexplicable escalation, and upon discovering evidence of deliberate external manipulation. Humanity's specific and considerable capacity for loyalty appeared to undergo what Director Vall's subsequent analysis would describe as a fundamental redirection. Rather than the sustained fracture his original doctrine had confidently predicted. They are not experiencing this as internal betrayal once they identify our involvement, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human sociologist whose extensive published research on community resilience Director Vall's intelligence division had, with considerable and ultimately catastrophic irony, been studying in preparation for the original campaign, unaware that her own work would eventually help explain his program's fundamental strategic failure. They are experiencing it as an attack from an identifiable external source against something they collectively value, and human beings across our entire recorded history have consistently demonstrated a very specific, very powerful response pattern when they recognize a shared external threat targeting something they collectively care about. They don't fracture further under that recognition. They organize. Sometimes faster and more effectively than they were ever capable of organizing before the threat revealed itself. Director Vall's 16 years of careful, methodical research into human psychological vulnerability had correctly identified loyalty as a defining and exploitable characteristic of human civilization. What his research had fundamentally failed to properly weight, buried beneath extensive documentation of human historical division and conflict, was the specific, considerable resilience of human loyalty when confronted with a clearly identified external adversary. A pattern his own empire's 3 centuries of successful conquest against considerably more psychologically fragmented species had never previously required them to fully understand. Humanity's historical record does document extensive internal conflict, precisely as our original intelligence assessment concluded, he wrote, in a formal report submitted to Ostrunkai High Command 11 months into a campaign that had, by that point, produced results directly contrary to every theoretical projection his 16 years of preparation had promised. What our assessment failed to adequately account for is the specific psychological mechanism underlying that historical conflict. Human internal division, throughout their recorded history, has consistently proven most severe and most sustainable when the population involved genuinely believes the conflict originates from legitimate, internally generated grievance, competing values, resources, or historical circumstance that emerged organically from within their own society. Our program's manufactured divisions, however carefully engineered to mimic these organic patterns, ultimately proved detectable, and once detected, produced a response our doctrine had never previously needed to counter. Human loyalty, we have discovered through this costly and ultimately failed campaign, does not simply exist as a static resource to be redirected through sufficiently sophisticated psychological engineering. It appears to function, instead, as a dynamic response specifically calibrated to identify and unify against genuine external threat, a capability that our attempt to weaponize their internal social fractures inadvertently activated at a scale and intensity our original theoretical framework never anticipated. The campaign's ultimate strategic consequence, documented extensively in Director Vall's final, considerably more sobering report on program Fractured Mirror's actual outcomes, represented precisely the inverse of what 16 years of careful theoretical preparation had promised the Ostrankai War Council. Rather than producing a fractured, internally consumed population, unable to mount coordinated resistance against the Empire's eventual formal invasion, humanity's discovery of the manipulation campaign produced, within the affected communities, and eventually across a considerably broader portion of human civilization, once the pattern became publicly documented, exactly the kind of unified, coordinated resistance infrastructure the Empire's original invasion planning had specifically hoped to prevent through program fractured mirrors' psychological groundwork. Human civil society organizations, previously fragmented across the specific political and cultural divisions our program had originally sought to exploit, began coordinating directly with each other upon discovering evidence of the Empire's involvement. Vesenkorath's final field report documented, 11 months into a campaign whose actual results bore almost no resemblance to its original theoretical justification. Organizations our intelligence had specifically cataloged as ideologically opposed, based on extensive documentation of their historical conflicts, began sharing intelligence and coordinating public response, specifically against the identified external threat. A level of cross-factional cooperation our original targeting model had assessed as essentially impossible given humanity's documented historical patterns of internal division. Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose published research had inadvertently informed the very program that would eventually validate her own broader academic thesis regarding human social resilience, offered a formal assessment of the phenomenon that would eventually be incorporated, through diplomatic channels neither side had originally anticipated, into the Ostrankai Empire's substantially revised strategic doctrine regarding human contact. "I think what your empire fundamentally misunderstood," she said, during a formal diplomatic exchange conducted years after the original campaign's costly conclusion, addressing officials who had, by that point, come to genuinely respect the specific analytical insight her research represented, "is that human internal conflict and human loyalty aren't actually opposing forces, the way your original theoretical model apparently assumed. They're the same underlying capacity, expressed differently depending entirely on what target that loyalty identifies as legitimate. We fight each other, sometimes viciously, when we genuinely believe the conflict emerges from real, internally generated grievance. But that same capacity for fierce, unwavering loyalty, once it identifies a clear external threat specifically trying to manipulate or harm something we collectively value, doesn't dissolve or redirect into continued internal fracture. It consolidates, often faster and more powerfully than anyone, including ourselves, usually expects. You didn't discover a species with a fatal weakness in our capacity for loyalty, Director Vol. You accidentally discovered exactly how powerful that same capacity becomes once it's pointed at a genuine, identified enemy, rather than at each other." Director Kesrath, Vol's formal resignation from the Ostrankai Empire's Psychological Warfare Division, submitted 18 months after Program Fractured Mirror's original deployment, and following an extensive internal review that would ultimately reshape Ostrankai conquest doctrine regarding human contact for decades to come, contained a final assessment that would become, within subsequent generations of Ostrankai strategic training, one of the most frequently studied case examples of catastrophic doctrinal failure in the Empire's considerable conquest history. I spent 16 years developing a theoretical framework built around a fundamental misunderstanding of what human loyalty actually represents, he wrote. I believed, based on extensive documentation of humanity's genuinely turbulent internal history, that this loyalty functioned as a static, exploitable resource, capable of being redirected through sufficiently sophisticated manipulation into a weapon that would consume the very population it was meant to protect. I have come to understand, through the costly and ultimately humiliating failure of program Fractured Mirror, that this assessment fundamentally inverted the actual relationship between human internal conflict and human loyalty. These are not opposing forces that can be traded against each other through careful psychological engineering. They represent, instead, a single underlying capacity for deep, unwavering commitment to a collectively valued community, a capacity that manifests as internal conflict only when that community genuinely believes the source of tension emerges from legitimate internal disagreement, and manifests instead as extraordinarily powerful. Rapidly consolidating unified resistance, the moment that same population identifies a genuine external threat, attempting to manipulate or harm what they collectively value. We did not weaken humanity's capacity for coordinated resistance through program Fractured Mirror. We inadvertently provided them with the clearest possible demonstration of exactly how powerful that capacity becomes once properly directed, and we handed them, through our own carefully documented manipulation campaign, the exact kind of unifying external threat that has, throughout their entire recorded history, consistently produced their most effective and most enduring examples of coordinated collective action. I do not believe humanity's loyalty represents an exploitable weakness. Counselors, whatever our original 16 years of theoretical preparation confidently assumed. I believe, having watched it operate directly against our own considerable strategic efforts, that it represents one of the most formidable defensive capabilities any species within our 4 centuries of accumulated conquest experience has ever demonstrated, precisely because it cannot be permanently redirected against itself without eventually, and often quite rapidly, redirecting back toward whoever attempted the manipulation in the first place. The Austrian Empire formally suspended all further psychological warfare operations against human territory in the years following program Fractured Mirror's costly conclusion, a strategic reassessment that would fundamentally reshape the broader empire's approach to eventual, considerably more cautious diplomatic engagement with Earth. Director Wahl, in the years following his resignation from active psychological warfare service, would spend the remainder of his considerable career as a cultural liaison, specifically focused on human-Austrian relations, a professional transition he would later describe, in his own extensive writing on the subject, as the direct and necessary consequence of finally understanding something his original 16 years of theoretical preparation had never once required him to learn. I tried to weaponize the thing that makes humanity most dangerous to underestimate, he wrote, in the closing passage of a memoir published decades after his original catastrophic miscalculation. I discovered in the process that some virtues cannot be turned into weapons against the people who hold them, because attempting to do so simply demonstrates, with considerable and often humbling clarity, exactly how powerful those virtues actually are when finally, fully provoked. Humanity's loyalty was never our vulnerability to exploit. It was always, from the very beginning of our misguided campaign against it, the specific quality that would eventually teach us, at considerable cost to our own strategic ambitions, precisely why 3 centuries of successful conquest against considerably more fragmented species had never adequately prepared us for a civilization capable of turning our own carefully engineered attack into the exact unifying force that would ultimately defeat it.